On this episode of Doing the Most, we're making a refreshing summer cider.
Homemade brews and various R2s, everything from mead to roast. Bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
If you live in the same hemisphere we do, you're probably wondering why we're making a summer cider in the winter. Well, for one, in the winter, apple juice typically goes on sale right after the holidays. And for two, you want it to be ready in time for summer, right? So now's a great time to get this project started. I've been making cider for a while, and I have a fairly versatile but also trusted recipe that I'm sharing with you. The ingredients for our summer cider are 5 gallons of apple juice, or 14 cans of apple juice concentrate and water to 5 gallons, or a combination of the two. 3 small lemons worth of juice, 5 grams of red wine tannin, and either an ale yeast or D47 wine yeast. You'll also need 1 cup of erythritol prior to bottling, and if bottle conditioning instead of kegging, you'll need 130 grams of dextrose to prime. Due to ongoing global concerns, there's a little bit of a scarcity of some items at the grocery store, so we had to blend apple juice and apple juice concentrate to mix up our must. You just want to make sure that you're using juice that doesn't have any preservatives and follow the directions to mix it up to the right concentration if using cans. And smile for the camera. And juice our lemons. We're using an antique juicer here that I got from my great-grandmother. And basically I'm just splitting the lemons in half, putting them in the juicer, and squeezing out all the juice. This juicer is supposed to juice and seed the lemons, but it doesn't really do a great job of straining out the seeds. But I'm not worried that a few seeds made their way in here. We use lemon juice in this recipe to give it a little bit of that lemony zing, but mostly to give it some citric acid to kind of combat against the malic acid that's so prevalent in that apple juice. The citric just gives it a little bit of a pop of freshness that kind of helps give it a crisp, fresh apple flavor on the palate. Then we add our red wine tannin. I'm just weighing it out here on a precision scale, and I'll leave a link to that scale in the description of this video. The tannin in this cider is purely for mouthfeel. It just helps it coat your mouth so those apple flavors stick around a little bit. I have done this recipe several times using raisins as a mouthfeel and body builder, and I haven't gone to the length of doing like an A/B test on this, so your mileage may vary, but usually I would add about 3/4 of a pound to a pound of raisins to get the same mouthfeel. The benefit of using red wine tannin here as opposed to raisins is purely economics. Red wine tannin is dirt cheap compared to a box of raisins. After our tannin goes in, the main event, all of that apple juice and concentrate. Now, what we're going for here is a starting gravity of between 1.045 and 1.050. This will give us something in the range of crushable, because this is a summer cider meant to be a refreshing beverage during those afternoon barbecues in the summer heat. So we don't want it to be too awfully boozy. A note here, you can up the ABV of your final product by adding dextrose or cane sugar or brown sugar to this must. Just be aware of your yeast's alcohol tolerance if you want to bottle condition, because if you overshoot that alcohol tolerance and your yeast stalls out, you may not be able to get any bubbles in your final brew. Sometimes when I'm making the cider, I'll ratchet up the ABV to more like 9%, maybe bordering on 10%, just so you get a little bit more oomph per bottle. But for a summer sipper like this, just going with the gravity of the apple juice itself gives you a nice, refreshing, and crisp final product. There's an example of this process of supplementing the fermentable sugars in your cider in our Applejack video. So check that out if you want to see an example of how that goes. So whatever form of apple juice you're mixing up, make sure all those ingredients are combined with a little stir, 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 and get a check on your gravity. If using apple juice concentrate and you did your math correctly, your hydrometer should look something like this. And I'm using D47 here. In doing research for my Apples All the Way Down project, where I used apple wood smoked apple blossom honey to make a cider with apple juice, I learned that yeast choices for ciders are very controversial. More than anything that comes up though, seems to be D47, which is one of my favorite yeasts. I keep it on hand and that's why we used it in this. You could also use a yeast like EC1118 for a nice clean ferment, or if you want a fun kind of funky ferment, you could use an ale yeast like a Saison yeast. And of course, if you want the ultimate clout, you could use Kvike. For this recipe, I don't rehydrate my yeast, I just pitch it right in dry. Give it a nice swirl,
And always make sure to keep copious notes.
Here at the beginning, if you're worried about time or clarity, you might want to add pectic enzyme. However, I've found that with sparkaloid and a little bit of time, it generally will clear on its own. Pectic enzyme is much more effective in primary, so if you've got it on hand and feel comfortable using it, go ahead and add it in. I went ahead and left it out for this recipe.
24 hours later, we're adding 2.5 grams of diamonium phosphate. This will act as our yeast nutrient. And then about a week later, I'd finished fermentation, so I racked it off. And we're going to be back sweetening this with erythritol, which is a non-fermentable plant-based sweetener.
The reason we use erythritol instead of honey or sugar or brown sugar is because erythritol is not able to be metabolized by yeast. That means it will stay sweet even if you've got active yeast in there. What this allows us to do is back sweeten it to where we want it and then add fermentable sugar, in our case this time dextrose, and that very small amount of sugar that we're adding will be just enough that you'll get a proper level of carbonation in your final product once it has time to condition in the bottle. I like a fairly dry cider, and so just 1 cup of erythritol in this is plenty for me. The final product with the recipe as is kind of on par with commercial varieties like Crispin.
So we're adding that at the rate of 1 cup for a 5-gallon batch, and this is just enough to give it a little bit of sweetness. If you like a sweet cider, you might double or even triple this. Just add to taste, and add this in slowly. Your erythritol contains nucleation sites. These are little tiny points that when they come in contact with the CO2 suspended in your cider will cause those bubbles to coalesce and then rise to the top. And if too much of that happens at once, you get this. So we add very slowly, bit by bit, to give it time to gas off. And then stir, 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 and we're stirring fairly gently here because we're releasing a lot of CO2 here, so we don't want a, volcanic eruption. And I choose to clear my cider with sparkaloid. Sparkaloid is a hot mix fining agent. You just add 1 tablespoon to a cup of boiling water, stir, 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 and add carefully and slowly to your finished wine, mead, or cider.
There are a few ways to carbonate this recipe, and we're going to be showing you how to bottle condition this. If you wanted to, you could add a fermentable sugar like honey and then force carbonate it in a keg. Would that be considered a sizer? When adding your priming sugar and before bottling, it's a great idea to get a clean rack to make sure you don't suck up any of that lees or yeast cake layer that's in the bottom of your fermenter. And that's what we did here. And there are a few ways of adding your priming sugar. Sometimes you may have seen us using carbonation drops, which is a pre-measured dose of dextrose that you put directly into the bottle when bottling. You can also use dextrose or other fermentable sugars to prime. Dextrose seems to be the most common. And it's best to mix that with some sterile boiling water before adding it to your cider. And you can add that 2 different ways. You could mix it up, put it in the bottom of your carboy, let it cool, and then rack on top of it. The swirling action inside of your carboy will help mix it. The reason you want to rack on top of it after it has thoroughly cooled is so you don't give your carboy thermal shock and crack your carboy. Quick brewing hack, just do it in a bucket. Or you can do what we did here and pour it directly through a funnel into your must and then gently stir. Either way, you just want to make sure that your priming sugars are mixed throughout the entire batch. You don't want a little bit hanging out at the top or a little bit sinking to the bottom because you'll get an inconsistent carbonation bottle to bottle, and sometimes that can result in bottle bombs. Nobody likes bottle bombs.
Once that had cleared, I did a clean rack to get it off the lees, so that way I'd have a very crystal clear cider to mix my priming sugar into. We're priming here with dextrose.
Just a side note, you could save your back sweetening with erythritol to this point if you wanted to.
So I'm just putting 130 grams of dextrose and equal parts water into this container and popping it in the microwave for 3 minutes to boil.
Of note here, 130 grams was my calculation based on the PSI that I wanted my bottles to condition to. Your mileage may vary, but I would recommend using a priming sugar calculator. That way you can know exactly based on what priming sugar you're going to use and what volume of cider you're trying to prime.
Stir, 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 and then gently and slowly add directly to our cider, making sure it doesn't hit the walls of that glass on the way down. And you can see here that this goes all the way to the bottom and mixes fairly thoroughly on its own, but we're going to give it some gentle stirring just to make sure it's mixed throughout. So stir, 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 and inspect your work. Then bottle away. And these should be bottle conditioned and ready to drink in 3 to 4 weeks.
And now for the main event. You may get a little haze in the glass if you empty out the bottle. That's because this is naturally bottle conditioned and there's a little layer of yeast sitting on the bottom of your bottle. That golden apple color is beautiful. The nose on it is crispy and effervescent, just like a good apple cider should be. You can feel just a little bit of that pop of acid in there. It's a nice indicator of what you're about to drink. It holds a decent foamy head, gets stuck in the old mustache. It's just north of dry, nice light sweetness in there, and the apple flavor really cuts through. It's so difficult to do a review of a nice cider though, because, I mean, it is what it is, right? Good apple cider is notable for being a good apple cider. It should taste acidic, it should taste appley, there should be just a touch of sweetness in there, and it should continue bubbling pretty much the entire time you drink it. At this lower level ABV, this is the type of thing that you could crush several of while grilling out with friends. And it's so refreshing, it's a little bit tough to put down. This one's ready to drink about as soon as the bottles are bottle conditioned, but a couple of months really treats it nice. So if you get it started now, by early summer, you should be good to go. So like I said, this is a versatile recipe. There's a lot of room to play with different types of tannin. There's also a lot of room to play with acids. If you want more appliness, more of that malic acid punch in there, you can actually add a few more cans of apple juice concentrate. It'll raise your gravity a little bit and create a little bit more alcohol, but it'll also infuse a lot more apple flavor into the product. And like I said, you could also raise the ABV with a little bit of brown sugar, so you'll get some of those rich molassesy notes that are kind of an undercurrent underneath that apple flavor. Or you could go all in on the lemon juice and do like 5, maybe 7 lemons, so it gets a nice tartness in there. I almost feel guilty even putting this out as a recipe because it's so simple and so versatile. You can really make this apple cider your own. It's apple juice, it's acid, it's tannin, and it's sparkle. And that's what makes it good. I hope you enjoyed this foray into apple cider making. And I'd love to hear your riffs on this recipe. If you're gonna brew this or if you've brewed an apple cider, let us know about it in the comments. I'm always curious to know what other people are doing in the cider space. If you haven't already, I'd love it if you would subscribe to the channel and maybe hit that bell icon so you'll know when our new content is coming out. You can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at doingthemostokay. Our website's doingthemost.org, and you can follow us on Twitch at doingthemostokay. We also have a Discord server. That's discord.doingthemost.org. Until next time, happy brewing, and here's to you.